The grain of the infrared camera makes everything look like a ghost story, but the weight of the object being dragged across the gravel is terrifyingly real. It's 3 a.m. in Gary, Indiana. August 11, 2024. The world is supposed to be asleep, but on the 1900 block of Malcolm X Boulevard, someone is working hard. A figure emerges from the darkness of a front porch. They aren't running. They aren't hiding. They are hauling a large, heavy black trash bag toward the trunk of a silver sedan. You can hear the fabric of the bag snag against the bumper. Then comes the sound that will haunt this neighborhood for years, a wet, heavy thud. It's the sound of something dense hitting the floor of the trunk. The car groans under the sudden weight. The silhouette pauses. They don't look around for witnesses. They don't look like a stranger in a mask. They look like someone finishing a chore. They reach out, grab the lid, and slam it shut. The metal-on-metal scream of that trunk closing is the last time Janiah McMichael's body is ever near her home. The person behind the trunk isn't a masked intruder. It isn't a predator from the streets. It's a face the neighborhood knows. It's the face that gave Janiah life. It's her mother, LaToya. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Janiah McMichael was a firefly in a jar. That's how the people who loved her described her. She was 14 years old, full of TikTok dances, silver butterfly earrings, and a laugh that could cut through the thick, gray smog of the Gary steel mills. She was bright. She was contained. She was fragile. She was a child dreaming of a world that didn't smell like soot and exhaust. But when the sun rose on August 11th, that light was gone. Step inside the house. The air on Malcolm X Boulevard is usually heavy with humidity, but inside the McMichael home, the air burns your throat. It's the sharp, aggressive sting of industrial-strength bleach. It's in the hallway. It's pooled in the tracks of the closet door. It's a scent that screams of a frantic attempt to erase something. While the community was outside taping flyers to telephone poles, flyers showing Janiah's wide, hopeful smile, the floorboards inside were still wet with chemicals. The girl's red and black sneakers were gone from the foyer. The screen door didn't latch right. Everything was staged to look like a runaway situation, but the smell told a different story. It was the smell of a cover-up. It was the smell of a mother scrubbing her daughter's existence out of the carpet before the police even arrived. The contrast is sickening. One room holds the memories of a child's dreams, the other holds the chemical evidence of her end. Think about the last person you would ever fear. The person who is supposed to be your sanctuary. Now, think about that person being the reason you never wake up. It's a thought that makes your blood turn to ice. Have you ever looked at someone in your own family, a sibling, a parent, a partner, and realized there is a wall behind their eyes? Have you ever felt that something was horribly wrong in your own neighborhood, but you stayed silent because it was family business? The problem in Gary wasn't just a missing girl. It was the silence. It was a house that turned into a fortress overnight. The curtains were drawn tight like eyelids that refused to open. The neighbors saw the car. They heard the trunk. But the McMichael family stood together in a line of lies. They told the police she ran away with a boy. They told the FBI she was rebellious. They used the community's heart against them. While people prayed for a safe return, the people inside that house were waiting for the rain to wash away the tire tracks. This wasn't a search. It was a hunt for a truth that was being choked to death by the people who shared Janiah's DNA. The most dangerous secrets are kept behind locked doors. Subscribe now so you never miss the warning signs. Detective Sterling Brooks didn't need a badge to know when a house was lying to him. He had spent 20 years breathing the iron-heavy air of Gary, watching the steel mills rust into jagged skeletons against the Indiana sky. He knew the rhythm of this city, the desperation, the noise, the sudden bursts of violence. But when he pulled his cruiser onto the 1900 block of Malcolm X Boulevard, he felt a different kind of pressure. It was a cold, dense weight that settled in his lungs. The street was quiet, but it wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a held breath. The McMichael home stood like a tombstone in the summer heat. While the neighbors stood on their porches, whispering and clutching their elbows, the house itself was dead. Brooks stepped onto the porch and felt the wood groan under his boots. He had seen hundreds of missing child reports. Usually, there is a chaotic energy, a frantic mess of toys, unwashed dishes, and a parent who looks like they are vibrating out of their skin. But when LaToya McMichael opened the door, Brooks was hit with a blast of air that smelled like a hospital floor. It was sharp. It was aggressive. It was the smell of a crime scene that had been scrubbed until it bled. He looked at LaToya. She wasn't crying. She was guarded. Her eyes moved like a predator's, tracking his every movement as he stepped into the foyer. She told him Janiyah was a runner. She told him the girl was difficult. But Brooks looked at the empty space where a pair of sneakers should have been and felt a spike of pure, uncut adrenaline. This wasn't a runaway case. This was a stage. And the lead actress was playing her part with a chilling, calculated precision. By the time the black SUVs of the FBI's gang response investigative team lined the curb, the air in the neighborhood had turned toxic. It wasn't just the Lake Michigan wind or the industrial grime, it was the psychological warfare happening behind the McMichael door. LaToya didn't greet the federal agents with a plea for help. She greeted them with a storm of shifting narratives that felt like a maze with no exit. To one agent, she claimed Janiyah had climbed out a window to meet a boy from Instagram. 10 minutes later, the story mutated. Now the girl had slipped out the front door while the house was asleep, taking a bag that no one could seem to describe. The friction was a physical thing you could feel in the room. Detective Brooks watched as the family formed a line of defense that felt more like a street gang than a grieving household. They were hostile, defensive, and perfectly rehearsed. Every time an investigator pointed out a hole in the timeline, LaToya would pivot, her voice rising into a jagged edge of indignant rage. She blamed the police for not being on the streets. She blamed the community for gossiping. She used her anger as a shield, trying to bury the investigators under a mountain of redirection. But the FBI wasn't looking at her face, they were looking at the gaps in her soul. Grandmother Beatrice sat in the corner, her hands white-knuckled around a Bible, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. There was a devastating lack of urgency in that house. No one was out searching the woods. No one was calling Janiyah's friends. They were all just sitting in the dark, waiting for the clock to run out on a girl who had become a ghost in her own living room. The kitchen tiles were still damp when Brooks walked through to the back of the house. The industrial ammonia was so thick it made his eyes water, a chemical screen meant to mask the smell of reality. He knelt by the sink, pulling back a stack of old, yellowed newspapers. There, caught in a splinter of the floor cabinet, was a tiny flash of silver. He pulled it out with a pair of tweezers. It was a silver butterfly earring. The post was snapped clean off, and the metal was twisted into a jagged shape. It hadn't fallen out. It had been ripped away. The violence of that small object told Brooks more than any of LaToya's stories ever could. This was a struggle. This was the moment a child's life was traded for a secret. He moved to the backyard, where the rusted swing set creaked in the hot Indiana wind. Near the base of the slide, a patch of earth looked different. It was darker, loose, and covered with a piece of rotting plywood and a heavy stone planter. It was a sloppy attempt at a grave or a distraction. When the cadaver dogs arrived, the atmosphere shifted from an investigation to a funeral. The dogs didn't care about the fresh dirt in the yard. They bypassed the plywood. They bypassed the garden. Instead, they ran straight to the family's old silver sedan. They began to howl at the trunk. The sound was a high, mournful wail that cut through the neighborhood, breaking the silence of the 1900 block. It was the sound of a truth that could no longer be contained by bleach or lies. Brooks looked at the car, the same car seen on the neighbor's camera, and he knew. He wasn't looking for a runaway anymore. He was looking for a body. He looked back at the house, where LaToya stood behind the screen door, her face a mask of cold, hard stone. Brooks knew the truth was buried in that yard. If you want the truth, hit subscribe before we dig deeper. The calendar flipped to 2025, and a brutal, gray winter settled over Gary like a heavy wool blanket. The news cameras had long since packed up and moved on to the next tragedy in Chicago, leaving the 1900 block of Malcolm X Boulevard to rot in its own secrets. To the public, Janiah McMichael was becoming a fading face on a dusty poster. But for Detective Sterling Brooks, the passage of time wasn't an ending, it was a countdown. He had turned his office into a graveyard of data, a space where Janiah's school portrait was the only thing that didn't feel cold. He was looking for a ghost, but he wasn't looking in the river or the woods. He was looking in the wires. The breakthrough didn't come from a witness. It came from a small, plastic burner phone found deep inside a ventilation duct during a secondary search of the McMichael home. It was a cheap, prepaid device that shouldn't have existed. While LaToya had handed over Janiah's primary phone, the one that went dark at midnight, she didn't know about this one. This was Janiah's lifeline. It was her private vault. As the forensic teams began to bypass the encryption, Brooks felt the first real crack in the ice. The phone didn't show a girl planning an escape. It didn't show a rebellious teenager looking for a boy. It showed a child who was terrified of the people she lived with. The metadata revealed that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Janiah had been using the camera to document her own life like a war correspondent. She was capturing the reality that LaToya and Dion were trying so hard to scrub away with bleach and lies. The digital ghost was finally ready to speak, and its first words were a warning that no one had been there to hear. The messages on that burner phone were a diary of a slow-motion disaster. Janiah wasn't just a victim, she was a witness. She had been recording the guests that Dion, her mother's boyfriend, brought into the house at all hours of the night. She documented the missing household items, the jewelry that vanished, and the frantic, whispered arguments about money that echoed through the thin walls. In the dark, while the rest of the world thought she was sleeping, Janiah was typing out her fear to a friend from school. She wrote about the strange, heavy smells coming from the basement and the way Dion looked at her when LaToya wasn't watching. The last message sent from that phone, just 3 hours before the neighbor's camera caught the silver sedan, was a chilling sentence that Brooks read until it was burned into his memory. "I think they found the phone. I'm scared. Don't call me." It was the final transmission from a girl who knew the walls were closing in. She wasn't running toward a new life, she was being hunted inside her own sanctuary. The messages painted a picture of a household that had become a predatory environment, where a 14-year-old girl was the only person standing between her family and the truth of their own decay. Every photo she took, every blurry video of Dion's temper, was a nail in a coffin they hadn't even finished building yet. LaToya had painted her daughter as a liar and a runaway to anyone who would listen, but the digital evidence showed a child who was more mature, and more terrified, than the adults meant to protect her. The firefly wasn't just bright, she was a beacon of truth in a house that thrived on darkness. But a text message isn't a body, and as 2025 dragged on, Brooks knew he needed more than words to break the silence of the 1900 block. Digital footprints are the one thing a scrub brush can't reach. While LaToya and Dion were busy cleaning the floors, their cell phones were broadcasting their every move to the towers looming over the Gary skyline. Brooks brought in a forensic analyst to map the 3 a.m. window on that fatal August night. The data was a surgical strike against their alibi. Dion claimed he was working a double shift at the warehouse, but his phone told a different story. At the exact moment the neighbor's camera captured that heavy trunk slamming shut, Dion's device was pinging off a tower less than a mile from the house. The movement didn't stop there. The signal moved with a grim, steady purpose away from the neighborhood, cutting through the industrial backroads toward the Grand Calumet River. This wasn't a random drive. It was a straight line to the deepest, darkest part of the water, a place where the current is slow and the mud is thick enough to swallow a secret forever. The phone stayed at the water's edge for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes to do a job that would change their lives. 12 minutes to discard a human being like a bag of refuse. What they didn't know was that the water doesn't keep secrets forever. The river is a living thing, and it moves in ways a killer can't predict. Brooks sat in his office, tracing the map with his finger, over and over. He knew the body was there. He knew the car was the vessel. But without physical proof, the case was stuck in the mud of the Grand Calumet. The tower data proved they were there, but it didn't prove what they had done. It was an open loop, a hanging thread that Brooks was determined to pull until the entire family structure came apart at the seams. As the summer of 2025 turned into a blistering, suffocating heat, the pressure inside the House of Whispers reached a breaking point. Brooks didn't just wait for evidence, he conducted a slow-motion siege. Every single day, at the exact same hour, he would drive his unmarked cruiser past the McMichael home. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't look away. He wanted them to see the shadow of the law through their drawn curtains. He wanted them to feel the ice cracking beneath their feet. The psychological toll was visible to the entire block. Neighbors reported the sound of glass breaking and the muffled roar of violent shouting matches erupting from the house at 2 a.m. LaToya had lost her job at the clinic, her reputation dissolved by the acid of public suspicion. Dion had become a ghost, rarely seen in the light of day, his temper simmering like a pot left on a high flame. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, bound together by a secret that was rotting them from the inside out. They had survived the initial investigation, but they were losing the war of attrition. Brooks watched as the family unit began to disintegrate. Grandmother Beatrice had suffered a stroke, her silence now a physical prison as much as a mental one. The community was watching, too. In the local barbershops and on the church pews, the theories had turned from, "Where is she?" to, "How could they?" Comment, "Guilty, if you think the mother knew from day one." Let's see who's paying attention. The world was waiting for the thaw, and it was coming in the form of a storm that even a mother's lies couldn't survive. Gemini said. The sky over Gary finally broke in November 2025. It was a relentless, bruising rain that turned the streets into rivers and pushed the city's aging infrastructure to the edge of collapse. For 3 days, the water hammered against the cracked pavement of Malcolm X Boulevard, as if trying to wash the very memory of the McMichael house away. But instead of burying the truth, the storm unearthed it. Near the banks of the Grand Calumet River, an old, rusted drainage pipe gave way under the pressure of the runoff. A city worker, sent out in the pre-dawn gray to clear a massive blockage of debris, saw something that didn't belong among the branches and plastic bottles. Tangled in the iron grating was a strip of fabric. It was a heavy, waterlogged material, stained by the river mud but still holding its color, red and black. It was a fragment of a windbreaker, the exact brand and size that had been listed on every "missing and endangered" alert for the last 18 months. When the worker pulled it free, the weight of it felt wrong. It wasn't just cloth, it was a tether to a night that everyone had been trying to forget. He didn't call his supervisor. He called the police. By the time Detective Brooks arrived at the riverbank, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle. He stood at the edge of the water, looking at that small, muddy piece of fabric, and felt a surge of grim validation. This was the payoff for 500 days of obsession. The river hadn't swallowed Janaya, it had been holding on to her, waiting for the right moment to give her back. The runaway lie was officially dead. The water had spoken, and it was telling Brooks that the silver sedan's midnight trip to the river wasn't a drive, it was a delivery. Inside the pocket of that sodden, mud-caked windbreaker was something that broke the professional shield Brooks had spent decades building. It was a small, plastic heart. A best friend's keychain, the kind sold in school book fairs for a few dollars. It was a cheap, colorful trinket that represented the entire world of a 14-year-old girl. It was a symbol of loyalty, of a life filled with sleepovers and shared secrets, a life that had been violently cut short. Finding that heart in the dark, cold drainage of the Grand Calumet transformed Janaya from a case file back into a child. She wasn't just a collection of digital pings or a silhouette on a grainy camera. She was a girl who cherished her friendships, even as her own home was becoming a house of horrors. The sight of that plastic heart brought a devastating clarity to the investigation. This was what she was carrying when the trunk slammed shut. This was what was in her pocket while she lived in a state of constant terror, documenting the dangerous men her mother allowed into their sanctuary. She had held on to that small token of affection while her own family was trading her safety for their own dark convenience. It was a physical anchor to her innocence. While LaToya and Dion were busy painting her as a rebellious, out-of-control teenager, this small piece of plastic told the truth. Janaya hadn't been looking for trouble. She had been a girl trying to hold on to the light while the people meant to protect her were actively extinguishing it. The keychain wasn't just evidence, it was a heartbeat from the past. It was a reminder that behind every true crime headline is a human being who loved and was loved. As the forensics team bagged the item, Brooks didn't see a breakthrough, he saw a tragedy that could have been prevented if the adults in that house had possessed even a fraction of the loyalty found in that plastic heart. The heart-shaped plastic was sent to the Lake County Forensic Lab, where it was treated like a sacred relic. In the world of crime, silence can be bought, and bleach can erase a trail, but biology is a witness that never blinks. The technicians worked in a vacuum of clinical precision, focusing on the metal ring of the keychain. They weren't looking for a visible stain. They were looking for the invisible, a microscopic miracle of touch DNA. While Dion was likely sitting in his living room, believing the river had finished his work, the lab was pulling his identity out of the mud. A partial thumbprint was lifted from the smooth surface of the plastic heart. Beneath that, a trace amount of genetic material was recovered from the tight coil of the metal ring. It was a match. The DNA didn't belong to a stranger or a rebellious boy from the internet. It belonged to Dion. The man who had spent 18 months acting as the grieving, supportive partner had left his signature on the very object that sat in Janaya's pocket when she was discarded. It was a mathematical certainty that shattered the family's narrative. This was the break that turned the tide. The case shifted from a recovery mission into a murder investigation with a clear target. Dion's DNA on that keychain proved he had handled her possessions, or her body, at a time when he claimed to be miles away at a warehouse. The digital pings and the physical evidence had finally converged. The blue wall of the McMichael family was no longer a fortress, it was a cage. Brooks had the science, he had the location, and he finally had the leverage to walk back onto that porch and demand the final truth. The scientific confirmation from the lab sent a shockwave through the investigation that felt like a physical blow. The lie that had been sustained for over 500 days was finally suffocating under the weight of a single thumbprint. For Brooks, this was the moment of validation that justified every sleepless night and every drive past that silent house. The community of Gary had been living in a state of suspended animation, caught between a hope they knew was hollow and a fear they couldn't name. But as the warrant was signed in the early hours of January 2026, the atmosphere on Malcolm X Boulevard shifted from suspicion to an impending storm of justice. The realization was sinking in for everyone involved, the monsters were never outside. They didn't come from the dark alleys or the rusted industrial parks. They were the ones who sat at the kitchen table. They were the ones who watched the "Bring Janaya Home" vigils from behind their curtains, knowing exactly where she was. The neighborhood began to wake up to the terrifying reality that the people they saw every day, the people they had offered comfort to, had been walking among them with the stench of the river on their hands. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any random act of violence ever could. The game of psychological chess was over. The investigators now had the one thing that no amount of industrial bleach could remove: a direct, biological link between the killer and the victim. The tension that had been building since August 2024 was about to reach its violent, final resolution. The House of Whispers was about to be forced to scream. Every secret, every muffled argument, and every midnight trip to the river was coming to the light. Evil lives next door while we sleep. Subscribe to stay informed and keep your community safe. On the morning of January 14, 2026, the bone-chilling cold of Gary was broken by the mechanical growl of tactical vehicles. The 1900 block of Malcolm X Boulevard watched through frost-covered windows as Detective Brooks and the FBI's Grit Task Force descended on the McMichael home for the final time. The neighborhood expected to see Dion in handcuffs. They had already tried him in the court of public opinion. But as the front door was kicked open, a different kind of horror took hold. The community didn't just see the boyfriend being led out into the stinging snow. They saw LaToya. She wasn't screaming for her daughter anymore. She was silent, her wrists locked in steel, her head bowed against the wind. The charges read out on the porch were a physical blow to everyone watching: direct complicity and obstruction. The investigation had finally stripped away the mask of the grieving mother. The neighbors who had brought her food and held her hand during vigils backed away in a wave of pure, concentrated disgust. The betrayal wasn't just that she had lied, it was the depth of the coordination. The neighbor's doorbell camera footage was played back during the initial processing, but this time, the investigators had the enhancement they needed. They could see the shadow of the person holding the trunk lid open while Dion struggled with the heavy black bag. It was LaToya. She hadn't been asleep. She hadn't been a victim of Dion's temper. She had been the lookout. She had been the coordinator. She had watched the person she brought into the world be treated like industrial waste, and then she had spent 18 months scrubbing the floors to make sure no one ever found out. The house hadn't just held a secret, it had held a monster with a mother's face. Gemini said. The final wall of the fortress didn't fall in an interrogation room, it crumbled in a sterile hospital ward. Grandmother Beatrice, trapped in a body failing from the stress of 1,000 secrets, finally looked at the recorder in Brooks' hand. Her voice was a dry rattle, a ghost of a sound that filled the room with a truth that was heavier than the river mud. She described the night of August 11th not as a mystery, but as a mundane tragedy. There was an argument. It was about the burner phone. It was about what Janaya had seen and recorded. Dion had reached for the device, a flash of violent temper ignited, and he pushed the girl. She didn't get back up. Beatrice watched from the shadows of the hallway as the life left the Firefly. But the true horror wasn't the accident, it was the meeting that followed. LaToya and Dion stood over the body and made a calculation. They didn't call for an ambulance. They didn't cry. They looked at each other and chose their own freedom over their daughter's dignity. They chose each other over that baby, Beatrice whispered, her eyes finally closing. They had spent 500 days protecting a killer because the killer was the only person left who knew the mother's true heart. The silence wasn't born of fear, it was born of a pact made in the presence of a child's body. The truth was out, and the House of Whispers was finally, hauntingly empty. The gray Indiana sky seemed to hang lower on the afternoon the community gathered at the edge of the Grand Calumet River. There were no cameras this time, no sirens, and no more questions. The industrial wind still carried the scent of the nearby refineries, but the stench of suspicion had finally lifted. Detective Sterling Brooks stood at the back of the crowd, his shoulders unburdened for the first time in nearly 2 years. He watched as 14 purple balloons were released into the air, one for every year of a life that was discarded but never forgotten. As they drifted over the water, they looked like tiny points of light escaping a jar. The Firefly was finally free. The justice delivered on Malcolm X Boulevard was cold and heavy, but it was the only truth Gary had left to offer. The silver sedan was in an impound lot, the bleach had failed to save the guilty, and the House of Whispers stood condemned and vacant. Janiah McMichael was no longer a face on a fading poster or a digital ghost in a ventilation duct. She was a daughter of this city who had finally been brought home to rest. The lessons of this tragedy are written in the silence of the neighbors and the stains on the kitchen floor. It is a reminder that the most profound dangers aren't always hiding in the shadows of the street. Sometimes, they are sitting right across from you at the dinner table. The truth doesn't care about time, and the water doesn't keep secrets forever. Justice took 522 days. If you're still not subscribing, tell us in the comments, what's holding you back? The sound wasn't just wood snapping. It was the sound of a 30-year-old secret gasping for air. In January 2026, a young couple in San Francisco thought they were just fixing a leak in their Victorian basement. They gripped the crowbar, muscles straining against the rot, and wrenched up a floorboard near the laundry room. The wood groaned, splintering into jagged teeth. And there, nestled in the damp earth, sat a rusted metal box. It wasn't supposed to be there. It felt heavy, burdened by the weight of decades. When the lid finally gave way with a screeching metallic protest, the air in that basement changed. It turned cold. It felt like someone had just walked over a grave. Inside, tucked away like a prize, was a hand-knitted sweater and a small, plastic card. The couple didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the remains of a life stolen in broad daylight. They were looking at the evidence that would shatter a community's peace and prove that a predator had been breathing the same air as them for nearly 30 years. This wasn't a time capsule. It was a trophy case. Wiping away the grime from the plastic card, a face appeared. Kristen Modafferi. She was 18. She was smiling. It was the kind of smile that belongs to someone who thinks the world is a safe place. That ID card, issued by UC Berkeley, had been missing since 1997. For 29 years, Kristen's parents had stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring. For 29 years, they had looked at every blonde girl on the street, wondering if their daughter had escaped, if she was out there living a life without them. But Kristen wasn't living. She was under the feet of a man the city trusted. She was a souvenir. Seeing that face in the dirt causes a specific kind of rage, a burning, white-hot anger that a human being could be reduced to a hidden box while her killer enjoyed the sun, the coffee, and the freedom she never got to have. Go back to June 23, 1997. San Francisco was choked by a thick, gray mist. People call it Carl the Fog, a local joke that feels a lot less funny when you realize how easily it hides a crime. Kristen finished her shift at the Crocker Galleria at 3 p.m. She was a hard worker, a scholarship student, a girl who did everything right. She told her coworkers she might head to Baker Beach to catch the afternoon light. She walked out of the coffee shop, blended into the sea of gray-suited commuters on Post Street, and vanished. No scream. No struggle witnessed. In a city of nearly 1 million people, she became a ghost. In 1997, you couldn't track a phone. You couldn't check a doorbell camera. When she didn't come home, her roommates waited. They thought she was with a friend. Those lost hours were the killer's greatest gift. By the time the alarm was raised, the trail was already cold. When the police finally arrived at the Land's End Trail, they brought in the heavy hitters. A bloodhound named Samson, famous for his ability to find a needle in a haystack. The investigators gave him a scent, a piece of Kristen's clothing. Samson took off, his nose pressed to the dirt, dragging his handler toward a bus stop near the Golden Gate Bridge. Then, the most terrifying thing happened. Samson didn't find a body. He didn't find a path into the woods. He stopped dead in his tracks at the curb. He looked up at the empty, foggy air and let out a long, mourning howl that made the hair on the detective's neck stand up. The scent ended right there. It didn't move toward the beach. It didn't go into the trees. It ended at the edge of the road, exactly where a car door would have opened. She didn't get lost. She was taken. Have you ever felt that sudden, sharp chill while walking a path you've known your whole life? That feeling that you aren't alone, even when the street looks empty? That is the instinct of survival. Kristen felt it too, but for her, it was too late. Do you know someone who has vanished from your own community? Someone whose name is still whispered in the grocery store aisles? The problem isn't just that she disappeared. The problem is that the person who did it was probably watching the search. He was probably nodding at the police, offering help. He left a riddle behind that mocked everyone for decades. A voice on a payphone whispered, "She's under the redwood." For 26 years, the police dug up parks. They destroyed redwood forests. They looked at the trees. But the truth was far more disgusting. We're going to show you exactly how a pillar of the community kept a girl in a box for 30 years. Subscribe now, because the person living next door to you might be the next one we profile. If you don't, you're choosing to stay blind to the shadows. Kristen was the type of person who made everyone else feel like they were standing still. At 18, she wasn't in San Francisco to party or waste time. She was there on a mission. With a scholarship to North Carolina State waiting for her, she had traveled across the country to sharpen her eye in a photography course at UC Berkeley. She was a girl who understood the value of $1 and the weight of a deadline. To fund her dream, she spent her mornings and afternoons at Spinelli's coffee shop, tucked inside the bustling Crocker Galleria. Her co-workers knew her as the girl who never complained about the early shifts or the heavy crates. She had an industrial-strength work ethic that made her stand out in a city full of drifters. June 23rd was supposed to be just another Monday. She was dressed for a casual afternoon, a hand-knitted sweater to cut through the bay breeze, her camera likely within reach, ready to capture the jagged beauty of the coast. When she clocked out at 3 p.m., she wasn't just leaving a shift, she was walking toward the rest of her life. She mentioned a trip to Baker Beach, a simple plan to enjoy the sun before the evening fog rolled in. There was no reason to worry. She was smart, she was capable, and she was careful. But as she stepped onto the pavement of Post Street, she wasn't just a student or an artist anymore. She was a target. In the eyes of a predator, her independence wasn't a strength, it was an opportunity. He saw a girl alone in a city that didn't yet know her name, and he decided that her story ended that afternoon. In 1997, the world was a much larger, darker place. There was no digital footprint to follow, no trail of GPS pings left behind by a smartphone in her pocket. If you walked around a corner and disappeared, you stayed gone. The Crocker Galleria was a hive of activity, a glass and steel cathedral filled with thousands of people moving in every direction. Kristen walked out into that chaos and effectively stepped off the face of the earth. In this era, the only way to find someone was through physical evidence, a witness who happened to look up at the right time, or a grainy security tape that usually showed nothing but blurry shapes. There were no Ring doorbells monitoring the sidewalks and no social media accounts to blast out an immediate alert. If you needed to reach someone, you looked for a silver payphone and hoped you had enough change. This was a world of paper maps and blind spots, where the distance between safety and a predator's car was only a few feet of sidewalk. The city didn't have a safety net, it had cracks, and Kristen fell through one of the largest. She wasn't just lost in the city. She was lost in a time before the world became a giant surveillance camera. This lack of technology gave her kidnapper the ultimate weapon: time. He knew that by the time anyone realized she was missing, the trail would be washed away by the rain and the heavy foot traffic of a Monday evening. He relied on the silence of the 1990s to cover his tracks, betting that the fog would hold his secret better than any vault. Gemini said. The silence at Kristen's rental house wasn't heavy at first, it was ordinary. Her roommates were acquaintances, people sharing a roof rather than a life. When she didn't walk through the door that Monday night, they didn't panic. They assumed she was staying over with a friend from her photography class or perhaps caught up in a late-night session at the lab. But as the sun rose on Tuesday and her bed remained untouched, the atmosphere shifted. The ordinary silence turned into a suffocating pressure. 36 hours passed before the realization set in that Kristen wasn't just late, she was gone. By the time the police were notified, the golden window for a rescue had slammed shut. The Modafferi family, thousands of miles away, received the call that every parent fears, the one that makes the ground vanish beneath your feet. They were thrust into a nightmare where the only news was no news. Every second that ticked by was a second their daughter was alone with whatever had taken her. The fog didn't just swallow Kristen, it swallowed the truth for decades. Subscribe now so you're never left in the dark when the shadows move. If you don't, you're leaving yourself wide open to the same silence that nearly buried this case forever. The authorities began to realize they weren't looking for a runaway. They were looking for a victim. The pain of the unknown began to rot the community from the inside out, creating a vacuum that was soon filled by a voice that claimed to have all the answers. This wasn't just a search for a body anymore, it was a psychological war. As the investigation stalled, a new kind of terror emerged in early 1998. It came in the form of a man who seemed to enjoy the agony of others. Garrett Sterling didn't wait for the police to find him, he inserted himself into the wound. He was a local contractor, someone who knew the city's bones, and he began calling the family's tip line with a terrifying frequency. He didn't speak with grief, he spoke with a cold, jagged authority. He claimed he was seeing things no one else could, visions of Kristen's final moments. He described the jagged, cruel cliffs of the Marin headlands with a precision that made the detective's blood run cold. He was a master of psychological torture, leading the search teams into the most treacherous crevices of the coast, only to watch them find nothing. Garrett represented the ultimate fear of a grieving family, the man who knows the truth but uses it as a leash. He sat in interrogation rooms, leaning back, mocking the law with every cryptic word about the salt air and the crashing tide. He was a dark cloud that refused to move, a reminder that sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one hiding the sharpest knife. Garrett Sterling didn't just enter the investigation, he infested it. He was a man who thrived on the jagged edges of other people's pain. As a contractor, he possessed an intimate knowledge of San Francisco's hidden spaces, the crawlspaces, the foundations, and the lonely stretches of the coast where the earth simply drops into the Pacific. He began to hunt the investigators with the same intensity they used to hunt the killer. He would call the tip line at all hours, his voice a low, gravelly hum that carried a terrifying confidence. He spoke about Kristen not as a missing girl, but as a puzzle he had already solved. He told the Modafferi family he could see her. He described her shivering in the dark, the smell of the salt air, and the sound of the tide hitting the rocks with a detail that felt like a confession. When he was finally brought into the interrogation room, he didn't shrink under the harsh lights. He leaned into them. Detective Marcus Thorne sat across from him, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, but Garrett was something different. He was a master of psychological manipulation. He would answer questions with riddles, leading Thorne down a path of half-truths and gruesome imagery. He spoke about the Marin headlands as if he owned the cliffs. He would describe the feeling of the wind on that specific night in June, watching the detective's reaction to see if he could draw blood. There was a sickening joy in his eyes, a mockery of the law that felt like a physical weight in the room. Without a body or a shred of physical evidence, the police were forced to let him walk. He became a shadow that wouldn't leave, a reminder that some men find power in the wreckage of a broken family. While Garrett Sterling played his games, a new horror emerged from the dark. It came in the form of a recording that would haunt the San Francisco police for over 2 decades. On the 3rd anniversary of Kristen's disappearance, a man stepped into a glass booth at the corner of Geary and Masonic. He didn't use a cell phone, he used a public payphone, ensuring his identity remained as hazy as the weather. The 911 operator answered, but what followed wasn't a cry for help. It was a whisper that felt like a blade. The voice was low, devoid of emotion, and chillingly specific. He didn't offer a name or a reason. He simply said that she was under the redwood. He told them they were looking in the wrong place. He mocked their focus on the Pacific, telling them she never actually left the city limits. "You're looking at the water," he said, "but you should be looking at the roots." Then, the line went dead. That single sentence turned the entire investigation on its head. It wasn't just a tip, it was a riddle designed to lead the authorities into a labyrinth. The recording was analyzed 1,000 times. Experts tried to scrub the background noise to find a footstep or a passing car, but the caller was a ghost. The phrase, "the redwood," became a local obsession. Did it mean a specific tree? A park? Or something far more literal? The police were forced to chase a ghost through a forest of possibilities. This wasn't just a lead, it was a mystery box that refused to open, keeping the family in a state of perpetual, agonizing suspense while the caller likely watched from the safety of the crowd. The search for the redwood turned the Richmond district into a graveyard of false hope. Armed with shovels and heavy machinery, the police began to tear into the earth. They focused on the city's parks, digging beneath the towering giants that gave the state its identity. Every time a shovel hit a root, a jolt of adrenaline shot through the team, only to be followed by the crushing weight of another empty hole. They excavated backyards and searched the crawlspaces of old Victorian homes, following the logic of a madman's whisper. The community watched from their windows, a mixture of terror and fury boiling in their chests. Each failed dig felt like a second abduction, a repetitive cycle of grief that refused to provide an ending. The frustration became a physical entity. Detective Thorne spent his nights staring at maps of the city, his eyes tracing the same streets until the ink seemed to bleed. The redwood clue wasn't just a lead, it was a taunt that stayed fresh even as the years began to stack up. People started looking at their own neighbors differently. They looked at the men gardening in their yards and wondered if the dirt they were moving was hiding a body. The case was no longer just about a missing girl, it was about a city that had lost its sense of safety. The resources were draining, the headlines were moving on to newer tragedies, and the silence from the earth was deafening. The lead went cold, leaving behind a jagged scar on the neighborhood. The riddle had done exactly what it was meant to do, it had wasted time, exhausted the law, and kept the truth buried just out of reach. By the time the calendar flipped into a new millennium, the trail was no longer cold, it was frozen. The posters of Kristen's face began to fade, their edges curling under the relentless sun and rain, yet the pain in the Modafferi home only deepened. Garrett Sterling remained a free man, a ghost who had successfully navigated the legal system by offering just enough to be dangerous but not enough to be caught. Some believe Garrett was the monster, others think he was a distraction. What do you think? Drop a "guilty" or "innocent" in the comments. Your insight might be the one that highlights a detail everyone else missed. As the years stretched into decades, the case became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers about the day the fog took a girl and never gave her back. The lead investigators retired, handing over boxes of yellowing files to a new generation who had only known Kristen as a photograph. It seemed like the killer had won. He had outrun the technology of his time and outlived the memories of many. But what he didn't count on was that the world was changing. Science was sharpening its blades in the dark, preparing to do what human intuition could not. The silence was about to be broken by a genealogical lightning strike that would reach back through 30 years of lies and pull the truth into the light. The wait was almost over, and the answer was closer than anyone dared to look. January 2026 arrived with a cold, digital precision that the investigators of 1997 could never have imagined. The days of relying on the instincts of a bloodhound or the erratic tips of a psychic were dead. The rusted metal box found beneath the floorboards of that Victorian home became the center of a forensic storm. Inside a high-tech lab, the air was thick with the hum of machines that could read the very code of human existence. The focus wasn't just on the sweater, but on the small Berkeley ID card. The lab technicians weren't looking for blood or hair, they were hunting for something invisible. They were looking for touch DNA, microscopic skin cells left behind by the hands that had handled that card nearly 30 years ago. The process of forensic genetic genealogy turned the hunt into a mathematical certainty. In the decades since Kristen disappeared, the world had voluntarily built a massive database of its own ancestry. People looking for long-lost cousins or curious about their heritage had uploaded their genetic maps to the internet, unknowingly creating a web that a killer could no longer avoid. The lab extracted a profile from the ID card that was sharp and undeniable. When they ran it against the National Criminal Database, it hit a wall. There was no match. The man who had taken Kristen had never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, and never been caught for even a minor crime. He was a ghost in the traditional system, a shadow that had lived a perfectly clean life while a body lay beneath his feet. But while he had no record, his family did. The DNA didn't find him, it found his bloodline. The investigators spent 3 weeks climbing a massive family tree, branch by jagged branch. They weren't looking through dusty file cabinets, they were scrolling through public ancestry sites, connecting dots that span generations. Every marriage certificate, every birth record, and every census entry was a step closer to the truth. They found a distant cousin in a small town 3 states away, a person who had uploaded their DNA to find a relative and ended up handing over a killer. From that single point of contact, the forensic team began to narrow the field. They weren't looking for a drifter or a career criminal like Garrett Sterling anymore. They were looking for someone who fit into the fabric of San Francisco society like a missing puzzle piece. The data began to cluster around a specific lineage in the Bay Area. It was a family of high achievers, people with clean records and respected names. This was the most agonizing part of the wait, realizing that the monster wasn't hiding in a dark alley or a prison cell. He was hiding in plain sight, perhaps sitting at a local diner or attending a community meeting. He had lived 29 years of a full, unburdened life because he knew he had no criminal footprint to betray him. He was a ghost who had outsmarted the law by simply being good. But science doesn't care about a man's reputation. It only cares about the truth left behind on a piece of plastic in 1997. The family tree was no longer a mystery, it was a roadmap leading directly to a quiet, tree-lined street in the Sunset District. The ghost finally had a name, and the name didn't belong to a criminal. It belonged to a pillar of the community. The investigators weren't just looking for a man, they were looking for a golden boy. The profile that emerged was terrifying because it was so ordinary. It described a person who had spent 30 years being helpful, being kind, and being a neighbor. The genetic trail led them away from the fringes of society and straight into the heart of a respectable life. This was a man who had watched the news of Kristen's disappearance from his own living room, perhaps even shaking his head in feigned disgust alongside his friends. He had used his clean record as a shield, believing that if he never broke another law, the world would never look under his floorboards. He was a master of the long game, a predator who had traded a moment of violence for a lifetime of calculated normalcy. But technology finally caught up to a monster. It stripped away the decades of lies and exposed the rot hiding behind a smile. If this happened in your town, wouldn't you want the tools to find them before they could blend back into the crowd? Subscribe to stay prepared, because the most dangerous people aren't the ones we see coming, they're the ones we invite over for dinner. The net was closing, and the shock of who was inside it was about to break the city's heart. The focus shifted from the screen to a specific house, a specific door, and a man who had spent 3 decades waiting for a knock that he thought would never come. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud in the early hours of January 14, 2026. The DNA didn't lead the police back to the volatile Garrett Sterling, nor did it lead to a nameless drifter. It didn't point to any of the usual suspects who had occupied the detectives' nightmares for 30 years. Instead, the genetic map pointed toward a quiet, tree-lined street in the Sunset District. It led to a house owned by a man named Arthur Penhaligon. He wasn't a man on a watch list, he was a man people went to for help. The realization hit the task force like a physical blow. The monster they had been hunting wasn't a shadow on the edge of town. He was a man who had spent his life shaping the futures of the city's youth. The mask of the Golden Boy was about to be ripped away, revealing a truth that was far more disgusting than anyone had dared to imagine. When the police cars pulled up to the house in the Sunset District, the neighbors didn't lock their doors in fear, they stepped onto their porches in confusion. They weren't watching a raid on a drug den or a flop house. They were watching the arrest of Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was a retired high school guidance counselor, a man who had spent 3 decades advising the youth of San Francisco on how to build their futures. He was the man you went to when you were lost. He was a marathon runner, a volunteer, and a pillar of the community who had spent his weekends in the very parks where Kristen's face had been posted on every light pole. The subversion of the monster trope was total. He wasn't the creepy drifter at the edge of the trail. He was the helpful neighbor who offered a hand. As the handcuffs clicked, Arthur didn't fight. He didn't shout his innocence or demand a lawyer. He simply stood on his manicured lawn and watched the fog rolling in from the Pacific with a look of profound relief. It was the look of a man who was tired of holding up a mask that had become too heavy to wear. For 29 years, he had lived a double life, molding the minds of children by day and sleeping inches above a stolen life by night. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the guidance counselor was led away, realizing that the person they had trusted with their children's problems was the same man who had destroyed a family across the country. The betrayal was a physical weight, a realization that the most dangerous predators don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they hide behind a desk and a smile, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to strike. Gemini said. Inside the interrogation room, the air felt thick with the ghosts of 3 decades. Arthur Penhaligon didn't wait for the detectives to break him. He seemed to want the words out of his mouth, as if the truth had finally turned into poison. The question that had haunted the city for 26 years was finally asked. What did the payphone caller mean by the red wood? Arthur's answer was a cold splash of reality that made the detectives want to wash their hands. It wasn't a forest or a park. It was a literal redwood planter box in his basement. He had kept her there, inches below his feet, while he lived a quiet, respectable life. He had tucked her ID card and her sweater into a metal box like a collection of trophies, a way to own a piece of her forever. The why was the most sickening part. It wasn't a calculated plan. It was a moment of sudden, jagged rage. He had crossed paths with Kristen at Land's End. He was a marathon runner, a man who felt he was in control of his world. He had offered her a ride when the fog turned biting, a helpful gesture from a good man. But Kristen had said no. She was smart, she was independent, and she didn't need a stranger's help. That rejection had triggered something dark and buried in Arthur. He couldn't handle a young woman who didn't need his guidance. He took her because he couldn't stand being told no. He spent the next 29 years hiding that moment of weakness behind a wall of respectability, believing that as long as he stayed a golden boy, the world would never look at the roots of his home. The weight of the truth didn't just break the silence, it crushed the foundation of the community. For the Modafferi family, the call that came in January 2026 wasn't the relief they had imagined. It was a cold, hard collision with a reality that had lived just a few miles from where their daughter was last seen. They had spent nearly 30 years looking for a monster in the shadows, only to find him sitting in a guidance counselor's office. The justice that followed was a quiet, somber affair. There were no cheers in the courtroom, only the heavy breathing of a family seeing the face of the man who had stolen their future. Arthur Penhaligon sat in the dock, a frail reflection of the golden boy he had pretended to be, his legacy of helping others revealed as a hollow shell. The moral lesson of the Kristen Modafferi case is a jagged pill to swallow. It reminds us that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who look the part. They are the respectable pillars, the helpful neighbors, and the mentors we trust with our children. They use their reputations as armor, betting that society will always look at their achievements rather than their basements. Kristen wasn't taken by a ghost or a drifter, she was taken by a man who knew exactly how to blend in. Her story ended not in a forest, but in the center of a city that had spent 3 decades walking right past her grave. The mystery of the fog was finally solved, leaving behind a warning that the person smiling at you over the garden fence might be holding the heaviest secret of all. The case of Kristen Modafferi serves as a permanent reminder that the truth is never as far away as it seems. It took 29 years for the world to catch up to Arthur Penhaligon, proving that while time can hide a body, it can never fully erase the stain of the act. The Modafferi family finally has a place to mourn, and the city of San Francisco has one less shadow in its streets. If you're still not subscribing, tell me why in the comments. Is the truth too dark, or are you just waiting for the next secret to break? Some stories are meant to be forgotten, but this isn't one of them. We will keep looking into the dark until every ghost is given a name and every monster is brought into the light. The engine is still humming. A low, rhythmic vibration that should mean someone is coming back. In the narrow, frozen corridor of a Cleveland alleyway, Raja McQueen's SUV sits like a dying animal. The driver's side door is flung wide, biting into the sub-zero wind. Exhaust fumes curl into the night air, white and thick, like a ghost escaping the tailpipe. But there is no Raja. There is no struggle. No scuff marks on the asphalt. No shattered glass reflecting the dim streetlights. Just a terrifying, hollow silence. Then, you see it. Sitting dead center on the driver's leather seat is a single, white lily. It is perfect. It is fresh. In the biting Ohio winter, where the air kills anything green in seconds, this flower is thriving. It looks like a signature. It looks like a mockery. Why would a monster leave a gift? When Detective Bennett Sterling stepped into that alleyway, the heat from the engine was still radiating against his skin. He realized at that moment that he hadn't missed the crime by hours. He had missed it by minutes. The seat was still warm. The radio was likely playing her favorite song. Raja Adriana McQueen, a woman whose career was exploding, whose vision changed the city's skyline, had been erased. The person who took her didn't just grab her. They replaced her with a flower. It was a message. A message that shouted, "I have been watching. I know her. And now, she is mine." A car left running. A door left open. A life stopped mid-sentence. Have you ever walked to your car in a parking garage and felt that sudden, sharp itch on the back of your neck? That instinct that tells you the shadows aren't empty. Most of us quicken our pace. We fumble for our keys. We get inside, lock the door, and breathe. Raja did all those things. She was careful. She was smart. She checked her phone one last time, her face glowing in the dark, thinking about her next design project. She felt safe. But safety is a lie we tell ourselves to keep from going insane. The problem in Cleveland that night wasn't a lack of security. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. The problem was a predator who didn't look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor. He looked like a friend. He was someone who knew how to hide in plain sight. How does a woman vanish in a city covered in cameras? How does a rising star become a ghost before her breath even hits the air? The answer is hidden in a digital trail that no one thought to check. A trail that would stay silent for 4 agonizing years while a killer walked the same streets as Raja's grieving mother. For the next 4 years, Raja's face became a permanent fixture on I-90. A digital billboard staring at the commuters, her eyes pleading for a truth that the city refused to give. The posters in Tremont began to rot. They peeled off the brick walls, layer by layer, until her name was nothing but a gray smudge. The investigation didn't just stall. It died. Detective Sterling kept that photo of the white lily in his top drawer. It taunted him. It was a perfect crime. No DNA. No witnesses. Just a flower in a void. The true crime world online tore the case apart. They blamed the family. They blamed the boyfriend. They looked everywhere except at the man holding the umbrella at her memorial. In a world of closed doors, the person watching you might be the one holding them open. They are the ones who know your schedule. They know when you're vulnerable. Subscribe to Final Traces right now. Because in the stories we tell, the monster isn't under the bed. He's the one who sold you the house. Subscribe so you are never the next name on a peeling poster. If you aren't subscribing, drop a comment below and tell us why. Is it because you think you're safe? By 2026, everyone thought Raja was gone forever. But a single piece of forgotten data was about to scream. A digital pulse from the past was waking up, and it was pointing directly at a man the city called a hero. Raja McQueen didn't just walk through Cleveland, she mapped it with her heart. To her, a crumbling warehouse in the industrial flats wasn't an eyesore. It was a canvas. She was the woman who could look at a wall of rusted iron and see a masterpiece waiting to be born. People called her the Vibrant Eye because she possessed a rare gift for breathing life into the deadest corners of the city. She was 27, thriving, and deeply connected to the pulse of the streets. Her design studio was a sanctuary of color and texture, a place where the jagged edges of Ohio's history met the soft elegance of modern vision. When you lose someone like Raja, you don't just lose a person. You lose the way they made the world look. Every boutique she designed, every gallery she touched, now feels like a hollow shell. Her absence created a vacuum in the community that nothing could fill. Her mother, Beverly, kept her daughter's drafting table exactly as it was on that final November night. The pencils are still sharp. The sketches are still pinned to the board. But the light that powered that room has been extinguished. The pain of her disappearance isn't a dull ache, it's a screaming, jagged wound. How does someone so bright, so full of kinetic energy, simply stop existing between a gallery door and her car? The city looked for her in the parks, the rivers, and the shadows of the old factories, but they were looking for a body. They should have been looking for a thief, someone who didn't just want her life, but wanted to steal the very way she saw the world. The cameras always found Beverly McQueen first. They captured her trembling hands, her eyes swollen from weeks of sleeplessness, and the way she clutched a framed photo of Raja against her chest like a shield. But if you look closer at the footage from those early vigils, your eyes will eventually drift to the man standing directly behind her. Preston Whitaker. He was always there, a steady, calming presence in a dark wool coat. While Beverly's grief was loud and shattering, Whitaker's was quiet and composed. He was a titan of urban development, a man who built the very luxury lofts and office towers that defined the new Cleveland. He claimed a professional bond with Raja, calling himself a mentor who had been guiding her meteoric rise. This was the first great deception. Whitaker didn't just attend the press conferences, he orchestrated the atmosphere. He was the one who handed out the candles. He was the one who whispered words of hope into Beverly's ear while the flashbulbs popped. To the public, he was the grieving benefactor, the golden son, using his vast resources to keep a daughter's memory alive. But there was a jarring disconnect in his posture. While everyone else in the crowd was hunched over by the weight of the tragedy, Whitaker stood tall. He watched the crowd with an intensity that didn't look like sorrow. He wasn't looking for Raja. He was looking at the effect her absence had on the city. He was measuring the vacuum he had created. He stood so close to the investigation that he could smell the sweat on the detectives. He wasn't just hiding in the light, he was the one controlling the switch. Preston Whitaker was the man who owned the keys to the city. He didn't just build skyscrapers, he built trust. As a prominent urban developer, his name was etched into the cornerstones of Cleveland's most expensive districts. When the investigation into Raja's disappearance hit a wall, Whitaker didn't step back. He stepped forward with a checkbook. He announced a $50,000 reward for any information leading to her return. To the neighbors and the local news anchors, this was the ultimate act of selflessness. He became the hero of the narrative, a man so moved by the loss of a colleague that he was willing to put a price on the truth. This reward gave him something far more valuable than a good reputation. It gave him access. Because he was the primary benefactor, detectives treated him like a partner rather than a person of interest. He was invited into the inner circle. He sat in the precinct offices, nodding solemnly as lead detectives shared their frustrations over the lack of leads. He watched them pin photos to the board. He heard which security cameras were broken and which witnesses were considered unreliable. Every time the police moved an inch closer to a breakthrough, Whitaker was there to hear the floorboards creak. He used his knowledge of the city's hidden corners, the service tunnels, the forgotten basements of his own construction sites, and the blind spots in the grid, to ensure the investigation stayed on a path to nowhere. He wasn't just funding the search, he was managing the failure of it. The Golden Son was the one who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he was the one who designed the map. The $50,000 reward hung over the city like a heavy fog. It seemed like a beacon of hope, but in reality, it served as a brutal distraction. By putting a bounty on the truth, Whitaker turned the search into a circus of greed and false leads. Every week, the police were flooded with calls from people looking for a payday, claims of sightings in distant states, theories about secret lives, and whispers of debts that never existed. These dead ends choked the system. Every hour spent chasing a fabricated tip was an hour the trail grew colder. Whitaker sat back and watched as the noise he created drowned out the few legitimate signals that might have pointed toward his own front door. His money bought him more than just time, it bought him a shield of untouchability. Who would dare suspect the man who was keeping the lights on at the search headquarters? He used his influence to steer the conversation toward a random act of violence, or a shady stranger in an SUV, making sure the eyes of the public never lingered on the high-end offices where he worked. The reward money wasn't a spotlight meant to find Raja, it was hush money paid to the entire community. It made everyone look at the check instead of the man signing it. While Beverly McQueen spent her nights staring at the front door, waiting for a creak that never came, Whitaker was in his study, surrounded by the sketches he had stolen from Raja's studio. He had bought the city's loyalty, and in the quiet of his Shaker Heights estate, he believed he had finally achieved the impossible. He had committed the perfect crime, funded by the very people who were supposed to stop him. The transition from a headline to a memory happened slowly, then all at once. By the arrival of 2022, the initial fury of the search had been replaced by a heavy, permanent silence. Raja McQueen's face was no longer on the nightly news, but she remained a fixture on the digital billboards lining I-90. Those high-definition eyes stared down at thousands of commuters every morning, a ghost in a sea of traffic. To the people driving by, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of the night. But for her family, those billboards were a form of torture. They were a constant, glowing reminder that while the world continued to turn, their lives were stuck in the freezing mud of November 2021. The city moved on. New buildings rose, some designed by the very man who had stood at Raja's vigil, and the name Raja McQueen began to fade into the background noise of Ohio's unsolved tragedies. Between 2022 and 2024, the investigation didn't just stall, it became a fossil. Detective Sterling's files grew thick with dead ends and useless tips. The "Find Raja" posters in the Tremont area were now just gray scraps of paper, unreadable and rotting under the relentless Ohio sleet. Every time a body was found in a nearby county, or a car was pulled from the river, the family's phones would ring, and the cycle of hope and horror would begin again. It was a period of suffocating stillness. The community had accepted that not knowing as the final answer. They assumed the city had simply swallowed her whole. But the silence wasn't empty. It was being maintained. It was being guarded by someone who understood that as long as nothing new was found, he remained the hero of the story. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the world to catch up to the digital trail Raja didn't even know she was leaving. The freeze finally showed a crack in late 2023, but it didn't come from a police lab. It came from a young woman named Talia Vance. She walked into the precinct with a story that made the air in the room turn brittle. Months earlier, she had been leaving a workspace near the same gallery district where Raja was last seen. She described a black SUV that didn't just pass her, it drifted. It moved at a walking pace, keeping rhythm with her footsteps. When she stopped, the vehicle stopped. When she turned into a well-lit storefront, the driver lingered. Through the tinted glass, she saw a man. He didn't try to grab her. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, illuminated by the dashboard glow, holding a single white flower against the steering wheel. He was watching her with a terrifying, clinical focus. Talia's voice cracked when she described his expression. She told Detective Sterling that the man wasn't looking at her like a person. He was looking at her like a piece of marble he was preparing to carve. He was measuring her. It was a gaze of total ownership. When Sterling pushed a stack of photos across the table, Talia didn't hesitate. Her finger landed on the face of Preston Whitaker. The golden son. The man who had spent the last 2 years comforting the McQueen family. The detective felt a surge of adrenaline, but it was quickly crushed by the reality of the file. Whitaker had an airtight alibi for that night, a charity gala attended by the mayor and half the city council. His digital footprint placed him miles away. The lead was logged as a fringe sighting, a case of mistaken identity fueled by the city's growing paranoia. They dismissed her, a decision that ensured the monster stayed in his mansion for 2 more years. The dismissal of Talia Vance was a victory for the architecture of the crime. Because Whitaker's alibi was built into the very social fabric of Cleveland, the police saw a contradiction they couldn't resolve, so they chose the path of least resistance. They chose to believe the record over the witness. It was a mistake that allowed a predator to continue his life of luxury while the truth sat buried in a digital archive. But by the dawn of 2026, the world of forensics had shifted. The investigation moved out of the interrogation rooms and into a basement lab where Leo Sterling, the nephew of the lead detective, began to dig into the data that the original team had deemed junk. He wasn't looking for blood, he was looking for a pulse in the machine. Raja's life had been integrated into a total sync, smart apartment system, and she wore a high-end fitness ring that tracked her every heartbeat. On the night she vanished, at exactly 10:14 p.m., her heart rate didn't just climb, it spiked into a zone of pure terror. For years, that spike was just a number. But Leo utilized a new software called Chronos mapping. This technology looks for what engineers call environmental handshakes. It's the silent conversation our devices have with the world around them. Every time you pass a Wi-Fi router or a smart hub, your devices reach out and acknowledge them. Leo discovered that at 10:22 p.m., 8 minutes after the heart rate spike, Raja's ring briefly shook hands with a high-end, encrypted Wi-Fi router. The terrifying part? That router wasn't stationary. It was moving at 40 miles per hour. It was inside a vehicle, acting as a mobile hub for someone who needed constant, secure connectivity. The digital handshake didn't just provide a location, it provided a name. When Leo traced the registration of that moving router, the encryption layers fell away to reveal a shell company used for high-end urban development. The trail led directly back to the corporate empire of Preston Whitaker. The realization hit the lab like a physical blow. The Golden Sun hadn't just been at the vigils, his technology had been the last thing Raja's ring communicated with before she vanished from the grid. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a fingerprint made of data, a ghost in the machine that Whitaker thought he had outsmarted. The killer believed he had deleted his footprints, but the tech in your pocket remembers everything. It records the moments you're afraid, the places you go, and the people who are standing too close. In a world where every move is tracked, the only thing more dangerous than being watched is not knowing who is holding the lens. Subscribe to Final Traces right now. We investigate the stories where the truth is hidden in the very tools we use to stay connected. Subscribe so you are never caught off guard by the people who build the world around you. If you are still not subscribing, tell us in the comments, do you actually trust your smart devices, or are they just witnesses waiting for a crime? For Raja, the device she wore to stay healthy became the only witness that wouldn't be silenced by Whitaker's money. Armed with this digital pulse, Detective Sterling realized the investigation hadn't been stalled by a lack of evidence, but by an architect who had built a wall around the truth. The time for theories was over. It was time to look beneath the pristine soil of the Whitaker estate and find what the Golden Sun had been hiding in plain sight. The digital ghost from Raja's ring provided the direction, but the ground-penetrating radar provided the proof. Detective Sterling didn't roll up to the Whitaker estate with sirens blaring. He knew that an architect like Preston would have a contingency plan for a front-door confrontation. Instead, the police arrived under the cover of a utility inspection. They wore neon vests and carried sensors, moving slowly across the manicured lawn of the Shaker Heights property. As the radar pulsed into the earth, the screen in the van began to render a terrifying reality. According to the official city blueprints, there was nothing but solid foundation and dirt beneath the garden. But the radar showed a massive, reinforced concrete void. It was a room that didn't exist on paper. It was a blind spot, designed by a man who understood how to make structures disappear into the landscape. The discovery sent a surge of cold validation through the team. This wasn't just a basement, it was a bunker. It was a space designed for total isolation, built with the same precision Whitaker used for his award-winning skyscrapers. While the public saw a philanthropist building a city, the police were looking at a predator who had built a tomb. The tension on the property was thick enough to choke. Every step the officers took over that grass felt like walking over a grave. They were no longer looking for clues, they were looking for the entrance to a nightmare. The Golden Sun was inside his mansion, likely watching them from a window, confident that his design was flawless. He believed that if a room wasn't on a map, it didn't exist. He hadn't counted on a digital heartbeat from 2021 leading the police to the exact coordinates of his secret. The raid didn't happen with a knock. It happened with a breach. At midnight, a tactical team moved through the rear of the estate, bypassing the security systems Whitaker had installed to keep the world out. When they finally found the heavy, reinforced mahogany door hidden behind a false wall in the study, they didn't hesitate. The hydraulic ram forced the lock, and the door groaned open to reveal a narrow, descending staircase. As the officers moved down, the air began to change. It didn't have the damp, metallic smell of a typical Cleveland cellar. It was warm. It was filtered. And then, the scent hit them. It was a thick, floral cloud of expensive perfume, the exact signature scent Raja McQueen had worn every day of her life. The sensory disconnect was staggering. They were 10 feet underground, surrounded by concrete and steel, yet it smelled like a high-end boutique in the Tremont district. The lead investigator felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't the smell of a crime scene, it was the smell of a life being forcibly preserved. The perfume was so strong it felt like Raja was standing in the room with them, a lingering presence that refused to dissipate. It was the first sign that Whitaker hadn't just taken her, he had tried to bottle her essence. He had created an environment where the passage of time was irrelevant. As the flashlights cut through the dark, the beams landed on polished surfaces and vibrant colors that had no business being buried in the dirt. They weren't just entering a hidden room. They were stepping into a man's obsession, a place where the air was a constant reminder of a stolen soul. The flashlight swept across the room, and for a moment, the officers froze in a state of total disorientation. They weren't standing in a dungeon. They were standing in an exact 1:1 recreation of Raja McQueen's design studio. Every detail had been obsessively mirrored. The specific shade of teal on the walls, the industrial shelving, even the way the fabric swatches were draped over the chairs, it was a perfect replica of the sanctuary she had lost 4 years ago. It was a morbid museum of a living mind. In the center of the room sat a drafting table, pristine and illuminated by a soft, warm lamp. On the table was a final, unfinished architectural sketch. The graphite lead of the pencil was still resting against the paper, positioned as if the artist had only stepped away for a moment to grab a cup of coffee. The level of calculation required to build this space was staggering. Whitaker hadn't just kidnapped a woman, he had tried to rehome her spirit into a cage of her own making. He believed that by recreating her environment, he could force her to continue her work for him alone. The validation of the horror was everywhere. This was the why that had eluded the police for years. Whitaker didn't want a ransom, and he didn't want a quick act of violence. He wanted to own her genius. He wanted to be the sole witness to her vibrant eye. The room was a testament to a man who viewed people as raw materials to be harvested and stored. Seeing that pencil resting on the paper provided a sickening clarity, Raja hadn't been a missing person to Whitaker. She had been a prize, a captive creator kept in a subterranean gallery built by the very man who claimed to be her mentor. The final layer of the deception sat in a small, velvet-lined drawer at the side of the drafting table. When Detective Sterling pulled it open, the last of Whitaker's golden sun persona disintegrated. Inside lay Raja's engagement ring, the one her family believed had been lost in the chaos of her disappearance. It didn't look like it had been discarded, it was polished, sitting on a pedestal like a crown jewel. Surrounding the ring was a digital camera and a stack of printed photographs. There were thousands of them. These weren't photos of a colleague or a mentee. They were images taken from the shadows, through the glass of her studio, from across the street at a coffee shop, and through the windshield of her own car. He had been documenting her life for 3 years before he finally struck. The sheer volume of the surveillance was a shock to the system. Whitaker had been a masterclass predator who had integrated himself into her world long before the alleyway in Tremont. He hadn't just taken her life, he had attempted to own her history, her talent, and her very identity. The realization was a heavy, physical weight in the room. He didn't see her as a human being, he saw her as a masterpiece that belonged in his private collection. He had built this tomb with the same care he used for his skyscrapers, believing that his status and his money made him the rightful owner of her genius. The Golden Sun was a thief of souls, a man who believed that if he built a beautiful enough cage, the world would never call it a prison. As the evidence was bagged and tagged, the truth finally stood in the light. The man who had comforted Raja's mother was the same man who had been measuring her for a grave since the day they met. The morning of the arrest was stripped of all drama. There were no sirens, no shouting, and no desperate chase through the streets of Cleveland. Preston Whitaker arrived at the Cuyahoga County Justice Center at 8 a.m., looking every bit like the visionary the city had come to worship. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a latte in the other, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't see the black vehicles flanking the perimeter. He didn't notice the sudden shift in the lobby's energy as the elevators remained held on the ground floor. When Detective Bennett Sterling stepped from the shadows, Whitaker didn't even flinch. He didn't drop his coffee. He simply stood there, watching the steel handcuffs approach his wrists with a look of detached, intellectual curiosity. The sound of the metal clicking shut echoed through the marble lobby like a gavel. It was the sound of a 4-year life finally collapsing. Whitaker didn't look at the cameras or the gathering crowd of office workers. He leaned in toward Sterling, his voice a low, steady hum that carried no hint of fear. He looked the detective in the eye and whispered a single sentence, "You finally learned how to read the blueprints, didn't you?" It was a final act of arrogance. Even in his defeat, he wanted the credit for being the architect. He wanted the world to know that he hadn't been caught because he was sloppy, he had been caught because the detectives had finally caught up to his level of design. He walked out of that building not as a man ashamed, but as a creator whose masterpiece had been discovered. The golden sun was gone, replaced by a man who looked at a life of murder as nothing more than a structural challenge. The interrogation didn't yield a confession of guilt, it yielded a lecture on aesthetics. Whitaker didn't speak like a killer. He spoke like a curator. He explained that the white lilies left at the scenes weren't signs of regret or flowers for the dead. They were his stamp of approval. In his twisted logic, Raja McQueen was a raw material that the world was wasting. He believed that by taking her, he was refining her genius, protecting it from a society that didn't deserve to witness her true potential. To him, the lilies were the signature on a finished work of art. He had spent years following her, documenting her every move, not to destroy her, but to collect her. He admitted that the hidden room in his estate was meant to be her permanent gallery, a place where she would be forced to create only for his eyes. The most chilling revelation came when he described the moment his obsession turned lethal. When Raja refused to draw a single line for him, when she refused to be the refined object he demanded, he decided that if he couldn't own her talent, he would ensure no one else could. He led the police to a remote, wooded plot of land he had purchased under a fake corporation years earlier. Beneath a grove of buckeye trees, he had placed her in the earth with the same cold precision he used to lay a foundation. He spoke about her end as if he were discussing a project that had failed to meet its specifications. There was no anger in his voice, only a profound sense of disappointment that his masterpiece hadn't cooperated. He had built a tomb before he even had a victim, proving that the Golden Son of Ohio was a predator who viewed the world not as a community, but as a series of acquisitions. The recovery of Raja McQueen was not just a police success, it was a city's reclamation. When the final shovel of earth was turned, the silence that had gripped Cleveland for 4 years finally broke. But the true power of the moment didn't come from the headlines or the court proceedings. It came from Beverly McQueen. On a cold morning at the memorial service, she stood before a crowd of thousands, not as a victim, but as a protector. She didn't speak of the Golden Sun or the subterranean prison. She didn't mention the man who had stolen her daughter's breath. Instead, she spoke about the light Raja had brought into the world before it was interrupted. She stood on a stage surrounded by the very sketches Whitaker had tried to hide in his basement, now blown up to massive proportions for the entire world to see. Beverly's voice remained steady as she announced that Raja's recovered work would be published as a citywide initiative. The sketches weren't just blueprints for buildings, they were the blueprints of a woman's soul. By releasing them, Beverly ensured that Whitaker's attempt to own her daughter's genius had failed completely. The vibrant eye was no longer a secret kept in a dark room, it was the new face of the city. The memorial was an act of emotional restoration. It turned the tragedy back into a legacy. As the final sketches were unveiled, the audience didn't see a girl who had disappeared, they saw an artist who had returned. The reclamation was complete. The city realized that while a predator can steal a life, they cannot erase the impact that life left on the world. Raja's art became the light that finally burned through the shadows Whitaker had built, proving that the truth is a structure no man can truly bury. Preston Whitaker built a world of shadows, and he almost won. He used the very tools of our civilization, the concrete, the blueprints, and the digital grids, to hide a nightmare in plain sight. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they are the ones who design the lights. They sit in the front rows of our ceremonies and sign the checks for our progress. But as Raja's story proves, no matter how reinforced the concrete or how deep the void, the digital trail of a life lived with purpose is impossible to fully erase. The machine remembered her when the world was told to forget. The golden sun is now just a number in a cell, while the woman he tried to bury has become the architect of a city's conscience. The truth is often hidden behind a polished facade, waiting for someone with the courage to look at the blueprints. If you want to ensure these stories never stay in the dark, and that the architects of deception are always brought into the light, subscribe to Final Traces right now. We don't just tell stories, we dismantle the lies that keep them hidden. Subscribe so you are never caught off guard by the world being built around you. And if you're not subscribing, tell us why in the comments. What story are you waiting for? What mystery is still keeping you up at night? Because in a world of master designs, the only thing that can't be manufactured is the truth.